What if someone told you that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle never actually existed? What would you use as evidence to say that he did? Although I've never heard anyone seriously claim that Aristotle never existed, I have seen people online claim that Jesus of Nazareth never existed. Could you use the same strategy for Jesus as you would use for Aristotle? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. In 2014, well-known atheist Richard Carrier published a 712-page book titled On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. Although Carrier put a lot of work into arguing that Jesus of Nazareth is essentially a myth, historians in the field were largely unconvinced. So here's a question for you. Why do you think most scholars in the field are critical of Carrier's work? The fundamental problem with Carrier's view is history itself. As Simon Gathercole of Cambridge University pointed out, Carrier's work is contradicted by the historical data. With that in mind, what is the historical evidence for Jesus? Perhaps one of the biggest things to explain away in history is the explosion of Christianity in the first century, with a ground zero in Jerusalem around 30 or 33 AD. Within 30 years, the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus records that there were vast multitudes of Christians in Rome itself by AD 64. By the end of the century, Pliny the Younger, governor of the Roman provinces of Bithynia and Pontus, wrote that there were so many Christians that the temples to the Roman and Greek gods were almost deserted. Simply put, if one wishes to deny that Jesus Christ is a very real historical figure, then we are left with a huge question. How do we explain this explosion of belief in Jesus Christ, originating in Jerusalem itself, if the person they believed in didn't even exist? If you are interested in reading in more detail the ancient historical evidence supporting the existence of Jesus of Nazareth, I recommend this book by Peter J. Williams, Can We Trust the Gospels? I endorse it because it is both very readable as well as reputable. Williams is a lecturer at Cambridge University and warden of Tyndale House at Cambridge. But until you get a chance to go through this book, let's look at a few non-Christian ancient historical sources for Jesus. Cornelius Tacitus was born around AD 56 and held a number of important Roman offices, including being a senator. He is most well known as a Roman historian and wrote at least 32 books around the end of the first century. He was clearly not a supporter of Christianity, describing it figuratively as a disease and a pernicious superstition. There are some fascinating things we can learn from his writings. First, Christ was put to death while Tiberius was emperor and while Pontius Pilate was procurator of Judea, where the city of Jerusalem was. Second, he writes that by the time of Nero and the Great Fire in Rome, there were vast multitudes of Christians in Rome just 3 decades after the crucifixion. Third, his writings confirm the rapid spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, which itself tells us that the homogeneity of the central beliefs of Christianity at this time, most notably that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, was a belief that would have had to be held as essential before the explosion of Christianity would have made such consistency impossible. Finally, the sincerity of the Christian beliefs were so strong that Tacitus records that many paid for it with their lives, dying horrible deaths. For example, Nero had many Christians covered with animal skins and then thrown to wild dogs to be torn to death. Others were fastened onto crosses and burned at night as night lamps. Pliny the Younger was born around AD 61 and distinguished himself by holding several public positions, including Roman governor of the provinces of Bithynia and Pontus. He is most well known for a letter he wrote to Emperor Trajan seeking advice on how to deal with the Christians in his area of jurisdiction. His letter and the emperor's response reveal some important details. First, that there were large numbers of Christians in that region of the Roman Empire, and that they were of all ages and all ranks. Second, many were so devout that despite torture and execution, they continued to stay committed to their belief even while they were killed. In the words of Pliny, the Christians sang to Jesus Christ as to a god. Flavius Josephus was a non-Christian Jewish historian who served Rome and was born around AD 38. He is regarded by historians as the single most important source for events in first century Palestine, with 30 books to his credit, written during the last half of the first century. In his writings, he confirms that Jesus was called the Christ by his followers, and that Jesus had a brother named James, which, by the way, the Bible also confirms, and that James was sentenced to death for his beliefs. So what can we confirm from these three ancient non-Christian sources? First, that Christ was crucified under the jurisdiction of Pontius Pilate. Second, that Christ was worshipped as God very early in the first century. Third, early Christians were subjected to some intense persecution and death. Fourth, Christianity, including its core belief that Christ had risen from the dead, spread swiftly, beginning in Jerusalem, the epicenter of the events surrounding Jesus of Nazareth. Fifth, Christ's family origins were known, including the fact that he had a brother named James. I very frequently encountered the objection that we can't find out anything at all from the four Gospels about the history of Jesus because the writers believed he was the promised Christ. So let me ask you a question. How does it logically follow that if you disagree with the theological statements in the New Testament, that, therefore, the historical statements are false? As you can probably see, theological statements are different from historical statements. Historical statements can be tested against history and archaeology. When we do that, we find that the four Gospels appear to be remarkably reliable when it comes to historical statements. For example, over the past few decades, new ways to test the historical accuracy of the New Testament have surfaced. For example, hundreds of stone boxes called ossuaries have been discovered in Israel that contain the bones of people who died during the first century. Many of these boxes are inscribed with the names of the person whose bones were inside, and from these ossuaries, researchers were able to compile a list of names used during the first century, as well as how often those names were used. This provided information on the most popular Jewish names in Israel during the first century AD. So what's the point? This database of information provides a way to test the New Testament accounts where Jewish names were frequently mentioned. The question was, did the most popular Jewish names in the New Testament in the Gospels match the most popular Jewish names as inscribed on the ancient ossuaries? Here are the results that you can see for yourself. Even though we have a much smaller sampling of names from the New Testament, we see 5 out of the 6 most popular names in the Gospels agree with the 6 most popular names on the first century ossuaries. This is a strong indicator that the Gospels were written in the first century either in Judea or by those who lived in Judea and about real people. This is just one small example of how modern research is being applied to test the historicity of the New Testament accounts, including the accounts of Jesus of Nazareth. As a result, the historical reliability of the Gospels has become more firmly established over the past few decades. The takeaway is this: even if you are presently unwilling to grant the theological statements made about Jesus of Nazareth, the historical aspects surrounding the life of Jesus do appear to be historically verifiable in many cases. As New Testament scholar Michael Bird, on behalf of the full range of scholars in the field, including atheists, agnostic, non-religious, and so forth, wrote in a review of Carrier's book, he wrote, "What we all agree on is that Jesus existed." So the take-home point is not too shocking. Just because there are internet conspiracy theories asserting that Jesus was a mythical figure, it doesn't mean that they should be taken seriously. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.